In 1944, one young soldier carried no rifle, yet his voice would confuse entire German divisions. His battlefield was silence, static, and deception, where every whisper could move armies. While others fired bullets, he spoke commands that never belonged to real units. His mission was simple: make the enemy believe ghosts were real. Rubber tanks, wooden cannons, fake radio chatter. And a boy from Brooklyn with steady hands. This is the untold story of Private Seymour Nussenbaum, the soldier who fought a war with sound. In March 1944, Private Seymour Nussenbaum sat inside a canvas radio tent near Verdun, France. He was 20 years old, quiet, precise, and assigned to a unit the Army did not publicly acknowledge, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, later called the Ghost Army. Outside, soldiers stretched canvas and rubber across wooden frames, shaping the outlines of tanks that would never fire a shell. Engineers checked air hoses, painters added false shadows, and men walked around the inflatables pretending to service engines that did not exist. The scene looked almost theatrical, yet every movement had consequence. Nussenbaum faced a different task. His battlefield was signal wire and headphones, his weapon a field radio humming with static. His job was to create the sound of armored units that were not. Their radio traffic, call signs, routine messages, all crafted to fool German intelligence. Around him, artillery echoed faintly through the trees. The real front line was miles away, yet the fate of thousands could shift here, in a tent filled with wires, paper codes, and a young soldier learning to make silence sound like strength. The Ghost Army did not work beside line infantry or armored battalions. Their missions unfolded just behind the front, in places where maps were drawn in pencil and uncertainty lived in every tree line. In those fields, before any inflatable tank was raised or radio dial tuned, the men first studied how real units moved. They watched truck convoys, measured spacing between tents, counted the number of fuel drums stacked behind maintenance trucks. Nothing could appear improvised. To fool a trained German observer, even footprints in mud needed to match the weight of real armor crews. Private Nussenbaum sat with code sheets and signal logs, learning the rhythm of armored radio traffic, not simply words, but pace, silence, and routine. Real tank units spoke in clipped phrases, never dramatic, always functional. His task was to copy them so closely that enemy operators would hear confidence where no tanks existed. These men did not prepare to fire or advance. They prepared to sound real, move real, and exist instantly, only long enough to redirect an army that never saw them. Before Private Nussenbaum sent a single transmission, he practiced listening. Real armored units did not speak constantly. They spoke with purpose, and silence was part of the language. A short burst for a fuel resupply, a clipped acknowledgement of new coordinates, a check-in that sounded more like habit than urgency. He learned how engines started in sequence, never all at once, how a column staggered ignition so movement sounded controlled, not hurried. Nearby, sound crews prepared recordings of tanks shifting gears, men shouting orders, and metal tracks grinding across dirt. These recordings would later be played through enormous speakers mounted on trucks, sending phantom battalions rumbling through forests. While the infantry sharpened bayonets and artillery units calibrated range, Nussenbaum and his team tuned radio dials and tested static levels. Their battlefield was measured not in yards gained, but in doubts planted in enemy radios. If their deception worked, German scouts would report forces gathering. And if headquarters believed them, entire divisions could shift, all because of sound without soldiers, engines without machines, and voices without bodies. The Ghost Army trained differently from every other American unit. They did not practice bayonet drills before dusk or run rifle inspections at sunrise. Instead, they studied maps with artists' focus and rehearsed radio patterns the way musicians rehearse timing. Soldiers who once sketched portraits now painted vehicle markings with regulation precision. Men who once tuned pianos adjusted frequency dials with steady hands. They learned not only how to mimic an armored division, but how to do so convincingly enough that German intelligence officers, trained and cautious, would accept the illusion. Private Nussenbaum spent evenings hunched over codebooks, repeating unit call signs until they felt natural on his tongue. The language of command had to sound lived in, not rehearsed. Outside the tent, crews inflated tanks under moonlight, checking seams and anchoring ropes to stakes hammered into wet soil. A single wrinkle could betray them. A single careless footprint could raise suspicion. There were no cheers, no speeches, and no banners in camp. Their success depended on being believed and on never being noticed while earning that belief. Official army records listed their role simply as special troops, a phrase so vague it revealed nothing and protected everything. Even nearby American units often had no idea who they were. When asked, they spoke casually, claiming to be engineers or signal support. The truth could not be shared, not even over friendly coffee or after long marches. If word spread, their illusion would lose its power. Their battlefield depended on secrecy more than steel. Before deployment near Verdun, commanders briefed them quietly, pointing not to enemy trenches but to deception zones marked by pencil, circles drawn around forests and crossroads rather than strongpoints. They were told the German army believed strength through movement, through radio order, through rumor. If they could feed that belief, Allied units elsewhere would gain advantage. Private Nussenbaum listened in silence, understanding the weight without glamour. Some soldiers fight to take ground, others fight to hold it. The Ghost Army fought so real divisions could reach the battlefield unseen, giving shape to battles long before TEY began. On a damp evening in early April, Private Nussenbaum keyed his first live transmission. The tent was dim, lit only by a single lantern swaying gently from the ridge pole. Outside, distant thunder could have been weather or artillery. In that part of France, the sky often answered questions before men could. He adjusted his headphones, checked the call signs twice, and tapped a short-coded mess. Age routine, unremarkable, indistinguishable from those sent by armored units across Europe. That was the goal. The Germans listening beyond the front line would hear nothing unusual, nothing dramatic, only the ordinary hum of military order. Around him, other operators worked quietly, maintaining the illusion of movement and preparation. Every pause, every static burst, every clipped acknowledgement had purpose. It was not imitation. It was performance without audience, precision without applause. When he finished, Nussenbaum removed his headphones slowly. Outside the tent, the night looked unchanged. No one cheered, no one saluted. But if the deception held, entire enemy units would shift in the darkness, guided by a message that never belonged to a real tank at all. A single radio message could begin the deception, but it could never stand alone. For the illusion to hold, the enemy had to see movement, hear engines, and sense the rhythm of a real combat unit preparing to strike. Soldiers dragged tire tracks across mud to mimic armored vehicle paths. Mechanics leaned into inflatable engines, wiping non-existent oil from rubber housings. Men hung laundry on lines, placed helmets casually on crates, and left cigarette butts where observers might expect tired troops to have stood. Every detail mattered because German scouts looked not only for tanks, but for life around tanks, the small signals armies leave when living in the field. Private Nussenbaum's transmissions served as a heartbeat, a pulse beneath the surface. If German intelligence intercepted chatter that matched what they saw through binoculars or aerial photographs, suspicion vanished. Here, deception was not trickery, it was construe. Tying a battlefield built without bullets, a fighting force assembled from fabric, sound, and human patience, convincing enough to shape enemy decisions before a single shot was fired. The Ghost Army did not only broadcast, they listened. Each transmission Private Nussenbaum sent created an echo, not over friendly lines but across enemy frequencies. German operators were cautious, skilled, and methodical. When they reacted quietly. A pause on the line, a sudden burst of traffic, a shift in tone, these were signs that the deception was working. Through static, Allied intercept units sometimes caught fragments of German concern, mentions of armored buildup, reconnaissance requests, or orders to reposition artillery. To Nussenbaum, such moments felt unlike victory in traditional terms. There was no cheer, only a subtle awareness that information had moved, that doubt had been planted. He logged responses carefully, pencil strokes steady despite the tension. Some soldiers saw enemies through rifle sights. He saw them in pauses and coded syllables. It was a different battlefield, one where hesitation replaced gunfire and silence carried impact. If the Germans believed tanks waited in the trees, then the real tanks miles away could move freely, unseen, unhindered, and one step closer to breaking the war open. The work demanded patience, and patience in war is rarely comfortable. Most soldiers feared sudden violence. The Ghost Army feared failure and stillness. While nearby artillery units shook the ground, their tents stayed quiet, lit by a single lantern and filled with men waiting for signals no one outside would ever honor with medals. 4 hours, Private Nussenbaum sat poised over the radio key, sending scheduled traffic just credible enough to suggest fuel convoys, supply platoons, and reconnaissance patrols. He did not fire a shot. Yet each message carried weight. A single error, a misplaced code, an unnatural pause, a phrase inconsistent with armored procedure, could expose everything. Sometimes, wind rustled the tent canvas louder than their equipment. Other times, rumbling trucks in the distance belonged not to decoys but to real units rushing toward battle. He heard the urgency of war without joining its noise. That distance was its own burden. Soldiers in the Ghost Army risked quiet consequences. If discovered, they would not face gunfire, they would face capture, interrogation, and the collapse of operations depending on illusion. Even around friendly troops, Ghost Army soldiers spoke carefully. The men they passed in chow lines or shared supply trucks with knew nothing of inflatable armor or scripted radio chatter. When strangers asked what unit they belonged to, they answered simply and vaguely: signals, engineering, or support. In war, anonymity can be armor, but it also isolates. Private Nussenbaum wrote brief letters home, never mentioning the nature of his work, only that he was safe, occupied, and learning much. He could not tell his family that battles moved around him not because of guns, but because of messages he invented. The secrecy extended within camp as well. Conversations were controlled by caution, humor used where honesty could not be. They lived among maps and equipment, yet often felt slightly apart from the larger war effort, aware that their victories would never appear in headlines. But as plans developed and missions succeeded, the men understood the truth. Quietly, deception was not avoidance of danger. It was a different type of courage, exercised in whispers instead of commands. At first, each operation felt like a test, as if the Ghost Army were proving not just strategy, but the value of imagination in a war defined by steel. Soldiers trained to fire rifles sometimes wondered whether deception carried weight equal to gunfire. But each time German units repositioned, each time reconnaissance planes circled over empty fields mistaking rubber for armor, doubt slowly gave way to confidence. Private Nussenbaum watched officers study intercepted enemy reports, noting references to phantom brigades and imagined concentrations of tanks. These moments were quiet, without cheers or applause, yet they marked success more clearly than explosions. Every confirmed movement meant Allied divisions elsewhere advanced with fewer obstacles, fewer casualties, and greater surprise. As results accumulated, the men no longer questioned purpose. They understood their strength came not from force, but from influence, from shaping the battlefield before the first shell fell. It was warfare measured not in destruction, but in decisions altered. And in that shift they found a quieter kind of power, one earned through precision, patience, and belief in a fight fought without being seen. Inflatable tanks fooled the eye, but sound fooled instinct. Long before a single loudspeaker truck rolled into position, sound crews studied recordings of armored units moving across rough ground. They listened to the staggered grind of tracks, the metal clank of hatches closing, the muffled shouts of crewmen coordinating movement. A tank battalion did not sound like chaos. It sounded like order in motion, layered and rhythmic. In a makeshift workshop, engineers cut and spliced audio tape with the precision of surgeons, crafting loops lasting minutes, sometimes hours. Microphones captured engine hum, gear shifts, and distant rumble, all blended to create the illusion of advancing armor. Private Nussenbaum observed this work with quiet respect. His role was radio, not sound, but he understood the connection. Audio without radio was suspicious. Radio without sound was incomplete. The deception worked only when every sense had something to believe. Days before deployment, the team rehearsed playback timing and speaker placement. They prepared not to attack, but to be heard, convincing enough that an enemy would prepare for a battle that would never come. When orders finally arrived for deployment, the operation moved with quiet precision. Trucks rolled under cover of darkness, headlights covered, engines kept at low idle to avoid drawing attention. The destination was not chosen for battle, but for belief, a crossroads where German scouts would expect movement, a forest edge where tracks and tents could be spotted from distance. At dawn, inflatable tanks began to rise, their rubber skins catching pale light as if steel armor were warming to morning. Canvas maintenance tents appeared beside them, fuel drums lined in orderly rows, and tire marks were dragged through damp soil to suggest heavy machinery had passed hours earlier. Private Nussenbaum took his place near the radios, code sheets prepared, voice steady. He transmitted brief, disciplined messages, supply runs scheduled, scout units reporting, fictional officers confirming readiness. No weapons were loaded. No artillery crews stood by. Yet in those quiet woods, a battlefield was being built, one designed not to fight an enemy, but to convince him he had already arrived too late. As the morning light settled across the field, the deception took shape in layers of routine. Soldiers walked between inflatable tanks carrying wrenches, rags, and fuel cans filled not with gasoline, but with sand to give them weight. They bent over rubber engine housings as if tightening bolts, stepped back, nodded, and called out short commands that sounded ordinary only because they were practiced. The goal was not performance, it was normalcy. Real units did not announce readiness, they lived it. Private Nussenbaum keyed scheduled radio messages while watching through a small opening in the tent. He saw the camp from the perspective of someone who needed to believe it, and even he felt the illusion hold. Human eyes trust movement before logic. A soldier polishing a rubber fender looks convincing if his posture is right, if his face holds fatigue, if his hands move with memory instead of hesitation. There, in that small clearing, men worked not to win a battle, but to create the shape of one, a force made of shadows that stood steady in daylight. Some missions end in rifle fire and shouted orders. Others end in stillness so complete it feels unnatural. By sunset, the Ghost Army's illusion at Verdun was fully in place. The rubber tanks cast convincing shadows, the tire tracks held the shape of weight, and faint rumbling sounds drifted through the trees in rehearsed cycles. No shells fell. No infantry advanced. Yet tension sat heavy in the air because success here meant nothing. Seibel only nothingness where danger might have arrived. Private Nussenbaum sent his final scheduled transmissions, recorded times in his log, and rested the headphones around his neck. He looked out from the tent, watching the edge of the field glow orange beneath a fading sky. Men leaned against crates, wiping sweat from their brows the way Real armor crews would after a long day of readiness. They spoke softly, laughed rarely, and waited. If the Germans believed the ruse, they would not attack. And in war, sometimes the greatest victories are the battles that never begin. Some missions end in rifle fire and shouted orders. Others end in stillness so complete it feels unnatural. By sunset, the Ghost Army's illusion at Verdun was fully in place. The rubber tanks cast convincing shadows, the tire tracks held the shape of weight, and faint rumbling sounds drifted through the trees in rehearsed cycles. No shells fell. No infantry advanced. Yet tension sat heavy in the air because success here meant nothing. Seibel only nothingness where danger might have arrived. Private Nussenbaum sent his final scheduled transmissions, recorded times in his log, and rested the headphones around his neck. He looked out from the tent, watching the edge of the field glow orange beneath a fading sky. Men leaned against crates, wiping sweat from their brows the way Real armor crews would after a long day of readiness. They spoke softly, laughed rarely, and waited. If the Germans believed the ruse, they would not attack. And in war, sometimes the greatest victories are the battles that never begin. Confidence and deception never arrived all at once. It came in small confirmations, a passing remark, a shift in enemy patrol routes, a command post rumor about German confusion. For Private Nussenbaum and his unit, belief was earned slowly, like dawn spreading across a field rather than a sudden flare. After Verdun, the men worked with steadier hands. Not relaxed, war never allowed that, but sure in the knowledge that precision produced results. They no longer wondered whether sound and rubber could influence a battlefield. They focused on doing it better. In the evenings, they sat on ammunition crates eating rations, speaking casually about ordinary things: home, weather, routine. Yet beneath the surface, a quiet pride settled in. Not the pride of victory banners, but the pride of purpose understood. There were no medals earned here, no official speeches praising creativity under fire. But the calm that followed each successful mission carried meaning, and the silence where gunfire might have been felt like proof. Success did not make the Ghost Army complacent, it made them meticulous. After each operation, they reviewed not explosions or casualties, but details: how realistic the tire tracks looked, whether mess tents appeared lived in, whether radio traffic rhythm matched real armored cadence. They studied what the enemy reacted to and what went unnoticed, learning which sounds triggered reconnaissance and which movements raised suspicion. Private Nussenbaum adjusted phrasing in transmissions, shortening acknowledgments, adding pauses that mirrored real field chatter. Authenticity did not live in constant communication. It lived in disciplined silence between routine messages. Inflatable crews improved shadow placement, painters studied how dust settled on real vehicles, and engineers refined speaker angles to bounce sound across valleys more convincingly. The men understood that deception was not improvisation, it was craft. And like any craft, it sharpened through repetition, shaped by small corrections rather than dramatic change. In a war measured by destruction, their progress came measured in realism and the quiet satisfaction of knowing unseen work could shift visible outcomes. As spring turned toward summer, the Ghost Army's role deepened. Real armored divisions pushed forward, and deception units followed close behind, never leading charges, never holding trenches, but shaping where resistance formed and where it hesitated. Their movements were tied to real battalions now, times so German intelligence would see phantom strength where Allied command needed pressure. Private Nussenbaum watched supply columns roll past toward actual fighting lines, engines rumbling with purpose. He understood that the soldiers inside those trucks would face danger his radio tent never would. Yet he also knew that their path might be clearer because he and his unit existed quietly in the woods behind them. His work remained the same: tune frequencies, maintain believable patterns, keep the voice of a fake armored force steady and calm. There was no heroism in his motions, only awe. Yet that routine allowed others to move without being seen, to strike where the enemy expected strength elsewhere. It was support measured not in ammunition fired, but in resistance avoided. With each successful deception, German intelligence grew less trusting. Early in the campaign, a few tire tracks and scattered radio chatter might convince scouts. But months into 1944, the enemy learned that American movements did not always equal American strength. Their reconnaissance patrols became sharper, slower, and more methodical. They lingered longer at tree lanes, studied patterns more carefully, and listened to radio traffic with greater scrutiny. Private Nussenbaum felt the shift not through reports, but in the tension of the camp. Decoys had to look worn, not staged. Tracks had to appear layered from days of use, not freshly carved. Sounds of engines could not play uniformly, they needed fluctuation, the fatigue of machines under strain. His messages required subtle imperfection, the kind that made them feel lived in, not rehearsed. The enemy was adapting. And adaptation in war meant the Ghost Army could never repeat a trick exactly the same way twice. Each operation demanded the same quiet, precision, yet greater creativity. The cost of a single flaw was no longer doubt, but discovery. Deception in war did not allow repetition. Familiarity bred danger. As German reconnaissance sharpened, the Ghost Army refined every element of their craft. Painters learned to vary mud splatter on inflatable armor so each vehicle looked used differently. Drivers dragging track impressions altered patterns daily, mimicking the randomness of real troop movement. Even trash piles, ration tins, cigarette stubs, paper scraps were arranged to look accidental, never placed. Private Nussenbaum adjusted radio discipline as well. He varied call intervals, inserted moments of fatigue into his tone, and studied intercepted Allied transmissions to match genuine field cadence. Authenticity grew not from adding more detail, but from making detail appear unplanned. The camp felt less like a staged operation and more like a living one, not because of what they built, but because of how they breathed life into it. In deception, perfection invited suspicion. Believability required the flaws of real. Soldiers' hurried footsteps, uneven noise, and messages that sounded shaped by time, not strategy. Sometimes the greatest sign that deception worked was not movement, but stillness. In late June, during a quiet operation near a French crossroads, scouts reported fewer German patrols than expected. It seemed reassuring at first, a sign the enemy hesitated, unsure whether to advance or hold ground. But seasoned officers understood hesitation carried danger. When an army pauses, it is often thinking. And thinking enemies are the most dangerous kind. Private Nussenbaum felt the shift in radio traffic: fewer intercepted messages, longer pauses, a watchful stillness in the ether. German operators were listening, not reacting. In the camp, soldiers adjusted their movements with greater caution. Footsteps softened, voices dropped. Every action felt like it took place under a magnifying glass. No enemy artillery fell and no infantry advanced. Yet the tension was sharper than in firefights miles away. For men who fought with illusion, silence it's not peace, it was examination. If the deception cracked here, its failure would not be loud. It would arrive quietly, with discovery instead of rescue. When doubt failed to reveal answers, the enemy tried something different: pressure. One afternoon, a small German reconnaissance probe advanced toward the deception zone, moving cautiously along hedgerows and stopping often to observe. They did not fire and they did not rush. Their mission was not combat, it was confirmation. In the camp, no alarm was called. The Ghost Army operated under a rule as strict as any combat order. Real soldiers do not panic when seen. Men continued routine, wiping dust from rubber armor, carrying crates filled only with rocks, and speaking in quiet tones that implied strength, not tension. Private Nussenbaum maintained radio traffic exactly as scheduled, neither hurried nor delayed. He added a single logistics message: fuel resupply ETATW. 0 hours, the sort of line scouts would expect to hear before movement. Through binoculars, German observers saw ordinary preparation, not staged fear. After 20 tense minutes, the patrol withdrew without firing a shot. In other battles, victory was measured in ground taken. Here it was measured in footsteps turning away. Within days, reports filtered through Allied channels. German armored elements had shifted north, repositioning to counter the force they believed was assembling near the crossroads. No one in the Ghost Army received official confirmation. Such information traveled slowly and rarely pointed at them directly, but hints arrived in fragments. A passing officer mentioned enemy tanks moving toward an empty field. A courier repeated a map rumor about German reserves changing direction. Private Nussenbaum marked the notes quietly in his logbook. There was no pride in the gesture, only acknowledgement. In war, every division that moved toward shadows was a division not facing men who carried real rifles and climbed into steel tanks that fired real shells. The deception did not win battles alone, but it shaped where battles would be fought, and sometimes where they would never begin. Around the camp, soldiers packed equipment with calm efficiency. The inflatable tanks slowly collapsed into canvas folds, sound cables were coiled, and radios powered down one frequency at a time. Nothing looked heroic, yet something meaningful had shifted, not on this field, but somewhere beyond it. The Ghost Army never stayed long. Their purpose was displacement, not occupation. Once enemy forces shifted, the unit packed in silence, rolling up decoys and folding nets as if erasing chalk lines before anyone could study them. Tires dragged across fresh soil to disturb deliberate impressions. Footprints brushed out, fires doused clean. By sunrise, the field where an armored battalion seemed to assemble looked ordinary. Scattered tracks, a few rope scars in earth, nothing more. Trucks rolled out in single file, canvas flapping, engines kept steady and quiet. No victory flags, no cheers, no explanation offered to passing units who saw them only as support troops. Private Nussenbaum rode in the back of a radio truck, gear tied down, logbook closed. He felt the rhythmic bounce of wheels over dirt, the hum of equipment beside him, and the peculiar mixture of fatigue and focus that came after a mission measured not by fire, but by absence of it. Ahead lay another field, another set of shadows to build, and another place where silence would matter more than sound. By the time summer deepened, the Ghost Army's role expanded beyond localized confusion. They now supported broad maneuvers, shaping the perception of entire corps rather than single battalions. Allied command began positioning them near major advances, not to fight beside armored divisions, but to appear instead of them, drawing German attention while real steel moved elsewhere. Private Nussenbaum felt the weight increase, not through shouted orders, but through planning maps filled with thicker arrows and more complex timing. His transmissions no longer represented a small force. They mimicked units with reputations, divisions known to the enemy, names that carried history. Each message required discipline. A misplaced signal could expose not just his tent, but thousands of soldiers maneuvering miles away. Success meant nothing happened where the Ghost Army appeared to gather, and much happened where they were not. In this strange arithmetic of war, stillness created velocity. Every field they made appear full allowed a real battlefield elsewhere to open. Victory traveled through wires, canvas, and FO. Footsteps unseen but essential. As the deception missions expanded, the enemy's reactions sharpened. More than once, German artillery opened fire on positions where inflatable tanks sat anchored to earth by rope instead of steel. Shells tore through canvas and blasted soil, sending rubber fragments into the air like torn cloth rather than shrapnel. To approaching units, it might have looked like destruction. To the Ghost Army, it confirmed something essential: the illusion held deep enough to provoke attack. Private Nussenbaum heard these strikes from his tent, feeling the ground tremble as if real vehicles had been targeted. There was no retaliation. Their strength was not force, but misdirection. He steadied his breathing, kept transmitting, and recorded times without looking up, aware that silence in panic was as critical as noise in deception. When the shelling ceased, there were no wounded to treat, no armor to salvage, only canvas scraps and quiet satisfaction. Pressure from the enemy did not break their purpose. It reinforced it. They had not stopped the battle, they had redirected one. As operations continued, a quiet truth settled over the unit. Their success would not be celebrated in parades or printed in communiques. Real infantry earned medals in mud and smoke. Real tank crews marked victories in steel and fire. The Ghost Army earned theirs in doubt and hesitation created, in movement prevented, in decisions bent by illusion. Private Nussenbaum accepted this slowly. No letters home could explain his achievements. No hometown newspaper could describe victories that existed only in absence of attack. At night, He listened to distant artillery and wondered about the soldiers fighting under those flashes, men whose paths might have been harder, whose losses might have been greater, had the deception failed. There was no bitterness in the thought. He knew every war required lines that did not move, voices that did not tremble, and shadows that held shape long enough for real armies to strike. Recognition might never arrive, but meaning did, carried quietly like a soldier's pack, heavy at first, then simply part of the march. In the final phase of this mission cycle, the Ghost Army did what they always did: they vanished. Camps were folded before dawn, tire marks disrupted until they became ordinary farm ruts, and radio frequencies returned to silence like water settling after a stone falls through it. No markers were left behind, no plaques hammered into earth, no trace that hundreds of men had shaped the battlefield without ever firing a shot. Private Nussenbaum packed his set with practiced movements, coiling wires as if sealing a chapter no one else would read. He felt no triumph, but no regret either. Their work was not meant to be remembered in dramatic scenes. It lived in margins of maps, in arrows redrawn by enemy planners who never saw them. As trucks rolled forward again, he looked out the canvas flap and watched the landscape blur, another field behind them, another ahead. For soldiers who fought with illusion, the road never ended. It simply shifted like the lines they manipulated, moving quietly, always one step ahead of sight. History often remembers those who charged, fired, and conquered. Yet here we remember those who protected with silence, who fought by being unseen, and whose victories left no wreckage, only the space for others to survive. If stories like this matter to you, let them travel further. Share them so these quiet soldiers are not forgotten. Thank you for watching and for helping preserve the voices that history once whispered.